Hello, I'm Rachel DeGuzman, producer of engagement programs for Geva Theater Center. We're here today for the prologue for the Chinese Lady. Geva prologues are lively, informative, pre-recorded chats that connect directors, designers, writers, and cast members with regional creatives, thinkers, and doers. Prologues delve more deeply into the world beyond the script by exploring a play's origin, providing context, and sometimes the creative process that shaped the production. For this prologue, we have Christina Lee, who teaches anthropology and is the coordinator of global education at Monroe Community College. Joined in conversation by Lloyds SUH, the writer of The Chinese Lady. This unscripted and unrehearsed conversation starts now as I fade to black. I'm fading.
Okay. Hi, Lloyd. You're muted.
Hello, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
So, I know this is an unscripted conversation, but I prepared a few questions so that I could have some kind of framework for myself. My background is anthropology, and so I like questions, and I'm a little nosy, so I had a few questions for you. So I thought maybe we could start by just talking a little bit about ourselves, like where you grew up and maybe how you identified both ethnically and racially growing up where you grew up.
Great, yeah. My parents came to the United States from South Korea in the early 1970s. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and raised primarily in the Indianapolis area, a little time in like the Terre Haute, Indiana area, and then for the most of my early childhood, or most of my childhood, in the suburbs of Indianapolis. And to the second part of the question, yeah, like in terms of my relationship and my sense of social location during that time was very much rooted in the fact that the community I grew up in was, pretty ethnically homogenous. My brother and I were only two of them among a handful of non-white students within a very large public school community. So like less than 0.5%. And so that was, I think that had an influence on just the way I located myself at that time, for sure.
Yeah, so very similar actually to my experience. So I'm also Korean American. I immigrated with my parents in the early 70s to Rochester, New York, which still has a very small Asian community, smaller Korean community. And we had like a close knit group of maybe 20 families, all who came from South Korea around the same time that I grew up with. But in my school district, where I went to school, my sister and I were only, maybe 5, maybe 3 Koreans, and that was including me and my sister, and maybe 5 or 6 other East Asian students at the school. So I had I actually have this picture posted of my 3rd grade class, and I'm literally the only student of color in that entire class. So that's probably why I'm an anthropologist in some ways, like why I was drawn to anthropology, because I was always trying to seek like my own identity and my own culture. I don't know if that's the same for you in terms of like the work that you do and what you've decided to write about.
Probably. I mean, there are parts of it that are still just psychologically mysterious to me about why I do the things I do. But some of the things that I can track, like I can certainly track that while I was, in high school and having difficulty locating myself, I definitely wanted to be a novelist at that point. Like it was very, my relationship with the written word, with fiction, was pretty. It was pretty intense. Like books were my solace. writing was something that I did in private and something that I felt like was my future. But then when I got to college and I felt this, that I was in just a bigger world, that I had glimpses of a bigger world, that it felt like writing for the stage became an ideal environment for me to do half of my work at home alone, still in that kind of like private thing, but the other half of it, I take what I've done alone and I get in a room and I work on it with other people, and I work on it with other people to see how it lives in the world. And so that part I can kind of track, because like that relates in some way. And so yeah, I think that it's all connected to where how it began.
When you were in college, were you always interested in writing about or writing Asian American stories, or did you start thinking about, or were you writing other kinds of things?
Yeah, no, I don't. It's hard for me. It's hard for me to define that, because I feel like it's hard sometimes for me to define what is an Asian American story and what am I, and even hard for me to define what am I writing about. It tends to be more impulsive than that. Like sometimes I surprise myself, and I don't. Yeah, it's just hard to tell. Like I think that early on, I was writing about just the things I was curious about. And sometimes that related to things that, from an outward perspective, one might say, oh, that correlates neatly with your, social location or political and social identity. And in some cases, it would be harder for an outward somebody to glean that. But for me, it's always felt like everything that I've ever written has always felt personal and directly related to all that stuff. So yeah, I don't know how to, I guess one way to answer that is to say, well, I go back and forth, or I go in waves, and I always have. And another way to answer it is to be like, that I've always circled the same kinds of things. It's just, there's variation in terms of how that manifests outwardly.
Yeah, and maybe this question then is too redundant, because I think, like in my growth, I think growing up in this very homogenous sort of white community, being one of very few Koreans, and then this whole Asian American identity, like I think I don't know if you did too, but I really identified as Korean for a long time, probably until college. And then I found an affinity with other Asian Americans, and more so in graduate school. But then like my academic interests were very much around race and ethnicity. Like I'm really interested in that narrative for Asian Americans, like this pan-Asian identity, which I think is unique to me growing up here. But and also really interested in sort of race and racism and how it impacts communities of immigrants here in the US. So I didn't know, like when you think about like your creativity, like how, like, is there an emphasis on race and ethnicity, or really is it just creative the way that you're saying, like it just sort of like whatever impulsively you're thinking about?
That's a great question. I think that the part of it that I am self-aware about is the part that where, because I'm not I'm not an anthropologist, and I'm not a cultural theorist, and I'm not even, and I'm not a historian. So like my relationship with all these ways of looking at race and ethnicity are interesting to me, but they don't really, like my work is a little different in that, like I try to focus on like an individual perspective on a story, even when it's related to history. So in a way, I tend to resist the I tend to resist certainty or clarity, I guess, is an evasive way to put it. Like if something is like, oh, well, this is clearly this or this is clearly that. I tend to resist, like I feel like my work is best when it lives in the grayer areas, when it lives in those things that are a little just more nebulous and mysterious and hard to describe. And so that's, that's complicated by the fact that I think as a citizen, I'm very much interested in the more like hard history, like progressive, uh, 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 theory, cultural theory, and the examination of that cultural theory. So I guess it just kind of like, I guess there's a kind of a fluidity and a tension between those two concepts. Just within me personally, it's sort of like I'm into the things that I'm into, and then the things that I want to dramatize, or even the things that I want to rehearse, like get in a room and rehearse with actors, are the things that are complicated or strange or confusing to me, that I just need to work out in a different way than what I might be able to work out just in my day-to-day life.
I like that you talk about this emphasis on sort of the individual story, because I think, maybe what's problematic, I think sometimes when you look at things academically, is that you think that you have clarity, right? But when you think about the intersections of personal identity, they're so complicated, and you can't sort of, you can't identify one type of Asian American or one type of Chinese American or Korean American, in any sort of context. Like our contexts are different, the way we experience the world is different. Our identities are so intersectional in different ways between class and gender. So I like that you focus on that, because like my brain goes to like, let's look at everybody and just see what kind of communal experience we are having. But it's so important to not make those sort of generalities or those assumptions about groups of people. And I think, I think we've seen that like more so in the last couple of years. But certainly that's true, I think, throughout history. And you see it with your piece, this historical view into this woman's, What were you going to say?
I mean, I think I get that. Like, I think that there are two ways that impulse can exist. There's a way which is like, that can get in your way, right? Where it's like, oh, the way I'm looking at this has a tendency to feel reductive of a people. But the other one, I think, is aspirational. Like, it's like, where are the ways in which we can find solidarity with anyone? And I think it's just overall human impulse. It's not even one that's like connected with like where is there commonality between people of a culturally specific group, but where is there commonality among all humans or among all beings? Like anything, it's just like looking for solidarity is an act of I think it's a natural human impulse, right? It's the way, I think it's part of this reckoning that's happening in America around history and around how depending on where you come from and how you look, in many ways, your relationship to American history is going to be very different. And so how do you reconcile that and still operate in a country like this? And so I think that's, it's all, that's only possible in trying to find the ways in which they're, and trying to even, when you can define the ways there is solidarity, you can even then name the places there aren't, and then just know and have an accounting of where you are in the world in that moment.
I think one of the things I thought about reading your play was this idea of the perpetual foreigner. And you were born in the States. So I was born in Korea, in Seoul, and I still think of myself as an immigrant, even though like it's 40 years out, right? So, and I didn't know what you thought about, I think because, racially, we're still seen as outsiders. We're still seen as sort of perpetual foreigners. I didn't know, like, do you feel sort of that gaze from others, or do you feel very much sort of part of the fabric of whatever this America is?
I mean, it depends on what room I'm in, it really does. I mean, there are, not only am I, like, I feel like, I don't know. It's such a hard question to answer because I feel like
I was trying for some easy questions, but
it's a really important question, and it's one that I've thought about quite a lot. I mean, like, not only am I conscious of that constant gaze, I know that I've internalized it in ways that I'm aware of, that I can feel, and ways that I can't feel because I have nothing to compare it to, right? That I know that it's just influenced who I actually am in ways that are unquantifiable, right? And that's one of the things that's interesting to me. That was, initial things about Afang Moy is like when you're presenting, when your life is, that's your job, that's your whole experience of a people is presenting a thing, gauging their expectations, understanding what they need, what is required of you in those situations. Of course, it's going to change who you actually are to perform an assumed identity. And that's something that I know is true. It's true of all of us. I mean, it's true of every human. It's just compounded and specific and really, really palpable in the case of stories like ours. So I think that, one of the things about just getting older is like finding my peace with most of that, and I found my peace with most of it. And I feel like I've come to a place in my life where I can own like myself and feel like, okay, if the things that are the way they are the way they are. And I think I've reconciled, almost all of it. There are certain situations though where I'm like, okay, this is bad. And I'm feeling, feelings that are not helpful. And so, yeah, I would say it just totally depends on what room I'm in. Yeah.
Thinking about rooms that we're in, like I find myself often on committees where I'm the only sort of person of diverse background. And I don't mind it, to tell you the truth. Like I like being in that position and perhaps being a voice that, work with others on bringing different perspectives. But I do like actually reading your play, I thought, how are others looking at me? Like, there's a part in your play where Afang Moy is in her 40s, and I think the line is like she is forgetting a little bit of her language, like she's so far away from her country, and like, even though sort of I identify as an immigrant or that I'm Korean, like that is so far away, right? Like even, talking to my parents, like they've lived most of their life here now. And the changes, right, in Asia are so different than they were when my parents left. So I don't know, I guess I was just thinking, even though like we don't have these sort of human zoos, the way that historically we have seen them, sometimes do you feel like you're in a zoo though? I guess that's what I was sort of thinking reading your play, Do you sometimes feel like you're in a zoo?
I mean, I want to be careful how I answer that because I think that I don't want to make light of the history of what people who did experience that literally, and like I don't like anything that to that extreme. But there are. I think that the fact that that her story resonated with me. I'm conscious of the ways in which I, I have peers like a lot of my peers just in the performing arts. We talk about this a lot, about just like, what does it mean to like be in a profession where it's like, it's not just expected, it's understood that what you look like is like, that is a major factor in whether you're employed, right? It's a criteria, right? And what you sound like and how you move and like just everything about how you present in the world. And it just creates this sense of like, thinking about how, like, what is the exchange that happens there within that knowledge, and what is the part that when you're voluntarily putting yourself on display, where is there, what unlike Afang Moy, what do you have agency? Where are the ways in which you do have agency in that exchange? What are the ways in which you don't? And just how do you navigate that? Not only during your time while you are on a stage, when you are on display, but in how you walk off afterwards and what you do with your life afterwards. Yeah, those are things I think about. Yeah, for sure.
Well, and I don't want to diminish sort of the cruelty of human zoos as they were historically, but I did think there is still cruelty in the way that we gaze at others today, right? The way we depict them, the way we talk about people, particularly in the last, I think, 5 to 6 years, in the way some people of color are othered, immigrants, outside of the sort of white norm, right? What the white supremacist sort of idea. And it is cruel still. Like, we're not putting people actually physically in a room and paying 25 cents to look at them, but the narrative is still very cruel. And the other part in the play that I was thinking about is sort of the social construction as things are being translated. There's that whole piece between Atung and Andrew Jackson and and I was thinking about social media and how things are continually socially constructed, the way that we gaze at others. And there is, I think there is a lot of good actually in some of the things that we do, but there is still some cruelty in those kinds of those socially constructed ideas. And also, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, it's deliberate, right? Like, we're deliberately constructing certain narratives so that we're either making it soft, not calling out racism, for example, or I don't know, we're moving the lens so that we're not actually looking at things as closely as we should. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a good point about social media. I think there's I mean, I have 3 kids. My oldest is 10, so thankfully, like I don't have, I've heard people people that I know who have teenagers in the complicated way they're navigating this. I'm grateful. I haven't had to go down that road yet, but I think that there is something about the construction of identity that where we are as a cultural in the cultural conversation is pretty interesting about how are the ways in which we're expected to construct a narrative around ourselves. How does that correlate or misrepresent what's actually going on in our lives and in our psychologies and our hearts, and in our relationships with each other, and how do they influence each other? How does one affect the other? And that's it's intense. It's intense to think about, especially for people of a young age. And constructed identity, obviously, and like I don't want to overstate or understate the fact that obviously all like there's a construction to any identity, and there's like all of this is influenced by attention between what folks are receiving and what folks are giving. But it all feels like we're in a point in time when it feels particularly urgent and confusing.
Do you think of yourself in your work as an activist?
Not in my, no, I wouldn't say so. Like I think that would again be what would it like? It would. I have too much respect for people who are actually doing like true activist work. Like I think that the work that people who I would say are legitimate. Like I don't think my work, my creative work approaches or has that kind of it doesn't have that specificity of intent or that immediacy of impact. And so I can't. I feel like yeah, it would feel sanctimonious for me to call it that. Without having said that, I would say that I hope that it does have a different kind of influence that is no less important, but is certainly like I would say certainly less immediate. But with that impact, like I think that storytelling to me is there is something sacred about it, and there's something that's hopefully portable across time. So like whereas like it's not like I've never thought about writing plays in hopes of influencing present tense current events, like influencing legislation or anything that specific, because writing plays is future tense. It's a future tense activity. You write a play and you're like, I don't know, this could take years before it ever sees an audience, so you can't know what the impact of it will be in the short term, but you hope that it has some sort of human or that it communicates something that can mean something to somebody in the future, somebody in a different location, somebody, somebody you might not have context for understanding how to influence, that you're trying to have do something that's really that broad. And so, yeah, like my answer to the question is to say, with a sense of humility that no, I don't consider it activism, but I also don't consider it less than what another person might be doing in the world with respect to what they believe.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as a reader and a consumer of literature, like I think I am drawn to Asian American writers because it sort of helps me grapple with my own identity, but also like I like assigning those kinds of things to students to read, to really look from a different perspective, because I think the way that we sometimes center voices tends to be really majority sort of Eurocentric. So it's important for me, for students and my own kids, to read things that aren't from that perspective, right? Because even watching TV or seeing movies, like you have to actually make an effort sometimes to be able to find those perspectives. And so to me, I think it's a really important way. Like it might not be impacting legislation at the first degree, but you hope, right, that those kinds of perspectives will influence the way that people move forward. Have you been surprised then, like since you probably wrote the play, before the last 2 years happened, before sort of this increased, really like probably the violence was there, but not in the degree that it was against Asians. Like, have you been surprised at the reception, or the feedback of the play now, even though you wrote it before these last 2 years?
Surprise is it's interesting that you bring in a surprise. I would say that the research of the play, I guess, prepared me for, that, like, I have peers who are like, I can't believe this is happening, and I guess a sense of surprise surprises me. I guess it surprises me that, like, how prevalent the narrative is this is brand new, or that this is happening because of one thing that just happened in the past few years. Not like this is like the historical context for these feelings, and even for like the people who are the most prominent people we think of when we think of where this rhetoric comes from, where this impulse comes from, that they are part of a trajectory, that they come from somewhere. I mean, none of this helps. Not like, I don't know how to talk about it. None of it helps in understanding it. Even when you understand it, it doesn't help you understand it, right? So, I mean, I don't know how to, I mean, again, it's one of those things, like just what I mentioned before about the ways in which something is portable across time. Yeah, like I wrote this play in a very different, in a very different cultural moment. And so I have noticed that this, particularly the ending of the play, has a very different, like, I don't know, I can't even define it, but that it has meant something, or it has tended to mean something pretty personal and pretty specific to the to the AAPI artists working on it, and to the AAPI audiences who experience it, that it feels different in a way that feels notable. And everybody, I don't know, it's a play that asks an audience to be themselves. And when you're asking an audience to be themselves, you're inviting them to respond, hopefully in a very personal way. And so you're inviting different audience members to respond to this play in their own way. And so they're going to respond differently. And I think that is true. And some people respond to it everybody responds to it with their own baggage, right? What is the baggage you're carrying? What are you carrying? And how does that influence how you connect to or don't connect to the end of the play? Or the totality of the play. And that feels appropriate. Yeah, it feels appropriate.